I'm Scott Allen Miller, and today on Sam IT we're going to talk about how the Ubuntu LTS releases don't necessarily mean what you think they mean. Now, I've written some articles on this, and sometimes this causes some confusion or emotional reactions. So Ubuntu Linux, right, the operating system, has two major releases. One is their LTS release. If you're watching this when it's current, their current LTS release is 16.04. They have a current release. Not a current LTS release, but a current release. That's 17.04. Two releases later than their LTS release. And of course, LTS is meant to stand for long-term support. And it is common within IT to have products that are labeled LTS or that are long-term support and products that are not. In the Fedora and Red Hat world, Red Hat itself is a long-term release, always. That's just how Red Hat works. And Fedora is a non-LTS or a current or a short-term release product on which it is based. Ubuntu works a little bit differently in that they simply release a new Ubuntu product every 6 months, and every fourth one, which is an even number year with the 04 release suffix, becomes their long-term support release product. So 12.04, so going back 10.04, 12.04, 14.04, 16.04, and in not too long, 18.04 will be their LTS releases. These releases get a very long-term support cycle with, like, I don't know the exact numbers, something like a decade that they stand behind that product. So if you put that product into production, they will support you for something like a decade. There are other releases, the three that come in between these. So since 10.04 as the first LTS, this would be 10.10, 11.04, 11.10, 13.04, 13.10, and so forth, right? It's all the ones. So currently there was 16.04 as the LTS, and then there was 16.10 and currently 17.04, and in a few months we're going to have 17.10 as our current releases. These come out, like I said, every 6 months, hence the numbering cycle, and they get a very short support term, more like 2 years. So if you want to stay on those, you have to stay current to get any type of support. Now, traditionally, it has sounded great. You want long-term support so you can stay on things for a long time, and we will discuss in another episode, I know I say that a lot, but we need a lot of episodes, why LTS matters and why it's a risk. But that's a separate thing and not related to Ubuntu. In the Ubuntu world, what we need to discuss is what they mean by LTS, because this is really important. In most cases, we assume as IT professionals that when we hear long-term support release that we are getting equal support or better support, and this is simply an implication that we shouldn't make, but we assume that we're getting this amazing level of support for a really long time. And in cases like Microsoft Windows and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, that is true. In the case of Ubuntu, it is not. Ubuntu does support you long term, and this is not a knock on Ubuntu, it is simply that they take a different approach to how the support works. Ubuntu will support you, but not for critical conditions at the operating system level, or things that are simply nonsensical for them to try to fix for their small user base if it's a small user issue. For those things, Ubuntu will require you to move to the current release. So for example, and I dealt with this directly, with 10.04 there was a poorly found, not very common race condition that could happen with the long-term release and made it unstable. It only affected a small number of users, and Canonical, who makes Ubuntu's response to that issue was, well, we're not going to fix it, you need to move to current because we'll fix it there. And that's a pretty logical thing for them to do. It makes sense financially, it helps the most number of users, and it's a very few number of people that are affected, and there's a solution. So there's no real reason to have been staying on the LTS release. You could move to something more current, fix that and other problems, get newer technology, and you're good to go. That was Ubuntu's way of dealing with support for the LTS release. Basically, the current releases get any fix necessary. They are guaranteed to get fixed. Ubuntu is not going to leave you hanging. But their LTS releases only get a lesser level of support over the long haul. You do get support, they're not making that up, and they will help you move to a non-LTS release. So there's that form of support. But they don't give the same level of support. They don't give the level of support assumed in the name, and it's purely IT professionals making an assumption that is not actually in writing anywhere, as they do for their current. So with Ubuntu, you really want to think carefully what it means to have an LTS release and why you are using it, which is surprising because in the Ubuntu world, LTS seems to be more popular with end users than their current, whereas other products, such as OpenSUSE, seems to have more interest around their rapid release products, in their case Tumbleweed versus Leap, which is their long-term support. So for some reason, Ubuntu, even though they focus less on long-term support in their long-term support products, has an ecosystem that seems to have gravitated towards it for some reason that I can never seem to get good explanations on. My recommendation is, unless you have a very specific reason when using Ubuntu, which is a great product, always go with their current releases and stay current. If you need their long-term support release, for example, because you're working with an application that only will support that version, then by all means you must use the LTS release. There's nothing wrong with the LTS release, but you should have a specific reason for sticking with it and should not do so as a default decision. You should default to the current release. If you're working with other products, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, OpenSUSE, Leap versus Tumbleweed, that decision may be different and there may be good reasons to stick with their long-term supports as your default choice. But in the Ubuntu world, I highly recommend moving to their short-term support, their current release cycle, updating every 6 months. They do a great job of making this painless for you, so there's no real reason to be sticking with the LTS release unless, again, you have some other technical need that's pushing you towards that. What's a little bit interesting is a lot of downstream products from Ubuntu, such as Linux Mint, rely on the LTS release. And you can kind of see why, because Mint doesn't want to be reinventing the wheel every 6 months. And if you look at someone like Karora, who does a short-term release with Fedora, they struggle to stay current because their project is simply very small compared to their parent product. So we can see with Linux Mint why they may make that LTS decision, but it also means that Linux Mint is being held back in a lot of ways that it wouldn't necessarily have to be. And oddly, for a desktop product, we normally want to see things moving a little bit more rapidly. But in general, with Ubuntu, lean towards the current. And if nothing else, when you make the decision to use LTS, simply make sure that you understand how it works, that if you hit a critical condition, your support may be that you have to move to current. And that may be more painful than if you had just stayed with current from the first place. And all the disadvantages of staying with an LTS, such as being more out of date, not getting the latest fixes as fast, may not be as beneficial as you expect them to be, given that should anything happen, you'll have to leave the LTS rather than the assumption that you should have stuck with it to get those things fixed. Thanks for joining me. I hope that this helps to explain the Ubuntu ecosystem and why its name is one thing and why it means different things than what people assume, and how this will affect you and your decision making around your deployment strategies with Ubuntu Linux. Remember to like and subscribe, and if you want to support us directly, you can. There'll be a link to Patreon in the notes below, and you can discuss any stories you have with Canonical support, how they've required you to move on to current, or if you have stories of support. Of course, they do provide support on LTS. It's just not the same level of support. So most people with most problems can use LTS, no problem. Thanks for joining me.